Alright guys, today's lesson's about satire, which is humor for the well-informed. We're going to start here looking at some websites that you might have seen in the last few days that are about, of course, the coronavirus. If you notice, they all look pretty similar, and if you run through each one here, you see some distinctions that are certainly about the same, right? So we have the flag of the corporation up at the top. We have all the different titles for the different categories. We have different articles. Trump considers quarantine, blah, blah, blah. We have some other previews for other elements over on the sides. On CNN, it's similar. They have their corporate flag. They have all the different categories. They have different articles, ER doctors, FDA authorizes. It's all about coronavirus, of course, right now. New York Times, similarly, they have their flag, they have all their categories, they have different pictures, their setup's a little bit different, but same thing, Trump weighs quarantine. And then we have another one called The Onion, which claims to be America's finest news source. It has different categories again. It has Trump here on the front. It has all sorts of different articles. And so if you were to look at all these, you might say, yeah, great, these are all different news sources. I can get my news from a whole bunch of places. Not a big shocker. However, one of these is satirical, and some of you might be familiar with it. It is called The Onion. And The Onion is using what you'll learn about in a minute called parody to poke fun at kind of the news that goes on every day in our world. And they have a team of writers who puts out this production to really poke fun at the world's news. Now, there's a key distinction, and I'll point it out right here, between making fun of something and satirizing. Those aren't exactly the same thing. You can make fun of something, and it's just making fun of it, and that could be mean or funny, because it could be ironic, right? But it might not be satire. Satire has a really important distinction, and that's that it's trying to improve something about our culture, something about humanity, or something about, for instance, a practice or institution in our culture. And so if we look at this even closer, right, we can see this, there's an article right here, and it's titled, "Defiant 123-year-old Not Going to Let Coronavirus Stop Him from Hanging Out with Friends," which is odd. And so what you would first notice is, unlike the other news sources, where the headlines, you read them and you're like, okay, yeah, I've heard that, that sounds about right. This one should strike you a little bit, and that's your first hint that the parody being used in this satire is satirical, because you're saying this is different. A defiant 123-year-old, which is interesting from the first step there, that it's a 123-year-old and he or she is defiant, to not going to let coronavirus stop him from hanging out with friends. So we gotta unpack this a little bit and understand how this is being satirical. So we're gonna look at this one specifically. So on this next screen right here, what I'm gonna ask you to do is go ahead and pause it, and I will make sure my face is out of the way. There we go. So that you can read through that. And then we'll move on and use this example a little bit later. So go ahead and pause your screen right now. And hopefully now you have unpaused it after having read that. And let's first look at this definition of satire. So satire is literary. It is meant for people who understand things. You need to know what's going on in the world to understand satire, and we'll talk about that in just a second in detail. But it's a literary manner or point of view which blends a critical attitude with humor and wit for the purpose of improving human institutions or humanity. That part is essential. It can't be satire when you just make fun of someone, their feelings are hurt, and you say, well, geez, I was being satirical. That doesn't work. Your goal has to be to improve human institutions or humanity. So that's a much more grandiose goal. It can't just be you want to improve, your sister from annoying you. That's not satire. It needs to be that you want to improve all siblings in the world from some kind of connection there, which is not a great example. And that's where satire doesn't really work on a 1v1 level. It generally speaks to that broader umbrella of humanity or human institutions. So let's look at how to understand it. Number one, we're going to look at audience and context. Number two, what methods does the author use? Number three, what is the writing's tone? So number one, audience and context. Satire fails miserably if you don't understand context. And for that reason, it relies significantly on the audience. And this might remind you a little bit of irony in that sense. You have to understand what's going on, or else the irony doesn't work because you don't get it. And therefore the satire doesn't work because you don't get it. So for instance, looking back at that example of this 123-year-old man, if you were here a year ago and you just happened upon, this article somehow in the future, you would be so confused because you'd be like, A, what's a coronavirus? B, why is he saying he's not going to stay home? And D, I think he's right. I think it was on C there, but I think he's right. And you'd be so confused because you wouldn't understand the context. Today, unfortunately, you get the context really well. You know what it's like to be social distancing and at home. You know what it's like to maybe feel that sense that you want to go see your friends, you want to be defiant, you want to go out. You understand that. And you also understand how dangerous this would be for a 123-year-old man, which is also kind of ridiculous just how old he is. 123, really? Come on. So that's where audience and context is critical. You have to understand what is really being discussed in the greater world to understand the satire. So it's not for the uneducated. It's not for people who just sit in a hole, want to read something. And in fact, it actually works against those people because they might read this and say, well, yeah, right on. We should go outside and just do whatever we want. But this is actually critiquing that idea. And we'll get to that by the end of the lesson. So next is, what methods does the writer use? And this is really interesting because there's tons of methods, but you don't need to use all the methods to be satirical. For your homework, you're not going to be able to use parody because the example is an obvious parody, but we'll talk about that in a second. But you could use irony, mockery, burlesque, or caricature. So let's walk through those really briskly. Again, feel free to slow this down and look through or repeat this video. Number one is burlesque. So in the idea of a burlesque is that there's a ridiculous exaggeration and distortion of the thing, whatever the subject is. And the real key distinction, because you're going to maybe think it's also caricature, in a burlesque, it's the discrepancy between the subject matter and the style. So think about that. So if the subject matter is really serious, a burlesque is created by making it really silly. Does that make sense? There's a discrepancy. So Adam Ziglis, one of my friends from Canisius College, he is a Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist. We worked on the college newspaper together. I was the photography editor. He was the artist. And he's awesome, wonderful artist. Again, won the Pulitzer 2 or 3 years back for cartooning. And this is one of his cartoons that illustrates burlesque. And here, it's a very serious topic, which is income inequity between men and women. And here he's drawn this woman pointing out the first 77 cents she's ever earned. Now, if you understand that income inequity, you get this really quickly and you're like, oh, nice, good point. Okay, that's pretty good. Some people, though, might not get that fully, and they might look at it and be like, huh, what is this even about? And the goal here would be that that person maybe researches this a little bit more. Or maybe the newspaper, the Buffalo News in this case, is also publishing an article about income inequity. And so you read that article that this illustration's next to. And in doing so, it causes you to hopefully rethink your understanding of income and certainly how it works between men and women and within our society. Our next one is parody, which we talked about at the beginning with The Onion, is a parody of CNN, New York Times, and Fox News because it looks just like it. A parody is where you're basically imitating, and you can read the definition there. It's a variety of burlesque, but you're imitating it. The reason it's a variety of burlesque is because you are taking something that's supposed to be sincere, like CNN and Fox is trying to be sincere, and they're doing an exact copy of that, but they're being silly about it. But because it's just that exact copy, it ends up being a parody rather than burlesque. because it's really not about the subject matter, it's just about the look of it, if that makes sense. It's not about the topic, it's about the look. Okay, so for instance here, with the Bill O'Reilly Factor was a very popular show on Fox News, and then Stephen Colbert came out on Comedy Central and made the Colbert Report, and it was intended to be a parody of Fox News and specifically the O'Reilly Factor. You can look up a lot of really good YouTube videos on them actually meeting and Colbert in character and out of character, and it's pretty funny to see Bill O'Reilly and his reaction to Stephen Colbert. And Bill O'Reilly is actually a pretty good sport about it, so it's pretty good. You should look those up. Maybe I'll link some in our Canvas page. Okay, the next one is caricature. Caricature is when you take one element of something within the whole discussion. So, you know, one element of, for instance, in the next image, one element of President Trump, or in this case, Bolton as well. And in this illustration, right, it's speaking about the impeachment, and it's using caricature here to especially illustrate Trump's hair, which is oftentimes kind of silly in how people will critique it, because I'm not sure why they care. Of course, as a bald person, it's not really my #1 concern. But because so many people talk about his hair and have talked about his hair, Adam Ziglis, again, another one of his cartoons, used this illustration to reveal the quid pro quo that he's hiding under his hair, because a lot of people would say it's a toupee or whatever it is. Feel free to look all that up. I'm not really interested. But that's the caricature Adam Ziglis is using within this illustration. Okay, the next one. I'm not going to show you an example for this. I think you'd understand what a mockery is if you've ever made fun of someone and you use their mannerisms or their stylings, their language or behavior. That's a mockery. And generally, it's directed at a particular person or thing, but oftentimes person. So again, I think you've probably mocked someone before. I'm sure you're all angels. I've certainly done it in my least proud moments. But mockery is simply where we tease someone, okay? Again, on its own, not satire, but within a combination of all these elements and with the goal to improve an institution or humanity in general, that is potentially satire. Okay, we studied irony a lot. I'm not gonna go into irony. You can go back and look through all those if you need a refresher on verbal, situational, and dramatic. Okay, so our example here, what you're gonna do for homework, and there's a nice little overview sheet that I've constructed for you that is very self-directed. You're going to look through the following 3 elements: the tone, the methods, and what institutions or practices and or groups are being satirized. The tone I have on the next slide for some reason, but there's really just 2 elements to it. Number 1, it can be Horatian, or number 2, it can be Juvenalian. Horatian is when it's funny, it's broad laughter, and you're like, chortle, 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 this is so funny, because you think it's just so funny, and then you suddenly start thinking about it, and you say like, wait a minute, I think that's critiquing something, and then you understand the satire. Juvenalian is where it's darker, it's harsher, it's often pointed at vices and errors, and it's done so with contempt and indignation. So, most of the ones we'll go over will be Horatian. The Onion is almost always Horatian satire. I will show you a Juvenalian next week. We'll read a longer work together. Okay, but here, obviously you've read through this hopefully, and it talks about this 123-year-old man telling reporters that he was not going to let the coronavirus stop him from hanging out with his friends. Right there, and right away, of course, we know this is parody. And number 2, we should know that this is also irony. This idea that a 123-year-old, someone who should really care about this, doesn't care about it. And he's not going to let it hang. He's not going to let the coronavirus stop him from hanging out with his friends. So I could point to that as irony, right? And the question would be, well, what kind of irony? That would be situational irony. I can also say that's mockery too, right? Because what we heard early on in the coronavirus, shortly after we left each other, is a lot of students saying, you know, I'm still going to hang out with my friends. I heard from students who said there are still parties going on. Today, I hope not, but you might have friends who are still hanging out with each other. And they're saying, I'm not going to let this thing stop me. And while we quickly say like, oh my gosh, 123-year-old, you shouldn't be doing that. we also might start to realize, and we have started to realize, that this thing's actually affecting people of all ages. And we're starting to say, okay, maybe we all shouldn't be doing this. And so it's starting to critique that practice that people are having of believing that what you need, that selfishness, that self-serving element, that what you want is best, that's what it's critiquing, right? It's critiquing this guy who, of course, should never be doing anything but social distancing. He's going out and doing this stuff. It's critiquing that idea of selfishness and self-serving. So the challenge, of course, with satire is sometimes it's tough to know who or what is being satirized. And you just have to play that game of, okay, there's a 123-year-old here. He's saying some hilarious things about, like, I'm not going to be quarantined. Where have I heard that before? And the challenge for you is to say, how am I informed? What have I read? What have I seen? And if you've been in a bubble and you've just ignored coronavirus completely, this would be tough to understand. I hope, because you're intelligent and should be well-informed young people, you have read, you have learned, and you have taken concern about what's going on and said to friends, you shouldn't be going out. And if so, this article is serving you and your purpose of that change in that institution or practice. What is the line between satire and simply being mean? There's no definitive line, but that goal is, what institution or practice are you trying to change? Okay, that's really the question you have to ask that. And then the risk of satire is that your audience might miss it. Someone could read this article about this 123-year-old man and be like, man, that guy's dumb, how stupid, and not realize that it's really critiquing the broader culture. And anyone who's saying, oh, I'm just going to go out, this is no big deal, I'm going to go out and have fun and do whatever I want to do. That selfishness and that self-interest. Especially at a time when people have to go to their jobs, doctors, nurses, people who actually can't stay in. They don't have the choice. They have to serve other people. And so that's where satire is really important, because it critiques these things that oftentimes we might not even want to talk about. Okay, I hope I didn't rush through that too much. If I did, I apologize, but I wanted to get this in a timely manner, about 16 minutes. Again, if you need to go back, you can review this pretty easily. I've also put up 2 documents on our Canvas. One is a document that you'll use to analyze satire, and the other one is basically this, but in a document form. And then, sorry, there's a third one too, which is this PowerPoint is also on Canvas. That's under the modules, under the satire module. And then there's your homework also there. So there's a Q&A. If you have questions, this is a little bit challenging. I kind of blew through it there, and satire is tough. So take your time with it. I gave you short examples so that you could sit with it and really think through what this is critiquing. Reach out to each other, try to figure it out together. That's great. Just make sure you turn in your own work. That's important. Miss you guys. Hope everything's well, and we'll talk soon.